Robbie Robertson was a Canadian guitarist, singer, songwriter, and actor. In the late 50s, he started playing with a band called Little Caesar and the Consoles. In 1957, he formed Robbie and the Rhythm Chords. They changed their name to Robbie and the Robots, and then changed their name again to the Suedes. Around 1959, he joined Ronnie Hawkins and the Hawks. In 1964, the Hawks left Ronnie Hawkins and became Levin and the Hawks. And in 1965, they joined with Bob Dylan to be Bob Dylan and the Hawks. In 1967, the Hawks became the band and continued to work independently and with Bob Dylan through to the late 70s. Robbie also started doing production work and in 1987 released his first solo album. He released 6 in total over the subsequent 30 years. He also had a prodigious acting career starting in 1980, and he died in 2023. Hi, my name's Dan. So this was the first solo album by Robbie Robertson. It's my first time listening to it, although I do know one track on here, which is Somewhere Down That Crazy River, which was the only hit that Robbie Robertson had in the UK. And I remember kind of fairly distinctly when it came out. I liked it, and I gathered that he was some kind of big deal. I think at that point somebody told me that he'd been in the band, but I didn't realise at that point that that was his first solo album. So let's come back to my listening to this album. So what I normally do is listen to an album twice for reviewing, and excuse me, and normally I'll do one listen as blind as I can, so without reading up any more information about something. So some albums obviously I know well, some artists I know well, but there's actually quite a lot of stuff on this list that I'm fairly ignorant about. And part of what's happening in this process is that I'm gaining an education. So tend to listen first without getting in the background, because that gives me a cold listen. I then do some reading and then listen again, and that gives me a more contextual listen. And this process seems to have worked well for me. When I first listened to this, then, first of all, I assumed it was going to be 70s, because I knew that Robbie Robertson had this single in the 80s, but that he was well known before this, or at least known. So I assumed that he'd had some kind of solo career before, and this fairly obviously not. When I listened to it, you could hear that it's an 80s album. That's fairly clear from the production. The other thing is that it reminded me a lot of Peter Gabriel. I thought this curiously sounds like Peter Gabriel stuff, and I was quite surprised by this. Turned out there were some really good reasons for this, and this is I was pleased to find that my ear was telling me things that actually had some basis. So there are 2 reasons. First, that Peter Gabriel himself does guest vocals on track 1, so obviously that was the first track I heard and the first impression that I got. He also plays on a couple of others, and there's a little bit of guest vocals on some of the others. The other reason is that it's co-produced by Daniel Lanois, who's a French producer who I've come across and know of, who worked with Peter Gabriel on a couple of his albums, I believe So and Us. And so that kind of what I think of as being a fairly distinctive Peter Gabriel sound from that era actually was quite strongly engineered by Daniel Lanois, and he was using it also on this album. So the production is similar. It also helps that he's got, amongst the other musicians playing on this album, Tony Levin, who's one of my favourite bassists, who worked with Peter Gabriel, and Manu Katché, who worked with Peter Gabriel. And Tony Levin also worked with King Crimson and loads of other people. He's an amazing bassist. And whilst I'm talking about other contributions on the album, also U2 crop up on this album 2 or 3 times, including one song where Bono sings kind of duetting vocals with Robbie Robertson. And so other members of U2, particularly to tracks 4 and the last track, I can't remember which number it is. And there's a couple of members of the band, obviously, who were a big. So, all these people, for all these reasons why it sounds like Peter Gabriel. So, music style is, I'd definitely describe it as rock. I wouldn't call it hard rock. I'd maybe say that some of them are kind of soft rock, but the the title that comes to mind is or the genre name is one that isn't used very often these days, which is AOR. Now, depending on who you ask, that can either mean album oriented rock or adult oriented rock. So, what happened? Again, this is my perspective of what happened in music, is that there was a whole lot of people who, like me, had their formative years in the 70s. And there was quite a lot of interesting, there was a lot of cheesy stuff in the 70s, but there was a lot of interesting and intelligent music being made in the 70s. And as they grew up, that kind of the chart hit end of the music, these listeners, and I was one of them, turned into album listeners. And a lot of the kind of the bands and the artists that kind of came into fruition in the 70s then transferred into this kind of album scene in the 80s, and particularly with British stuff. So this reminds me of a lot of those sort of things. And we're going to do some name checks here. Peter Gabriel, fairly obvious, I've talked about. U2, I guess. Simple Minds, Kate Bush, Eurythmics, Tina Turner, Dire Straits, Sting. And these were all people that I really liked around that time. And in fact, I have to say that if I'd come across this album at that time, I probably would have got a copy and I probably would have loved it. As it was, I only heard the one track. And so that wasn't enough to entice me into thinking of getting more. Um, so I would also say, if you like that kind of thing, if those names are names that go, oh yes, I like that, and you don't know this album, you might really like this album, like I do. So it's the production is fairly dense and rich and colourful. There's a lots of different sounds being used in here. There's lots of, particular the percussion production. So it's not just drums. There's percussion, and the drums are not. Um, I want to say it's not like full on drum groove at times. It's more kind of spaced out with little bits of percussion going in. And then this is all supported with extra stuff going around. And this production style, as I said, is one that I really like. It also reminds me of a couple of other producers I'm going to check out the names of that were very active at the time. Rupert Hine was a guy who uh, literally, I saw albums with his name as a producer on, and I bought them on spec because I liked his production work so much. Also, Hugh Padgham, who worked with Sting, has a similar sound to this. But the other one that is somewhat surprising because the vocals are so different. But Eurythmics, it reminded me a lot of kind of not the first kind of two or three albums, but the kind of later 80s stuff of the Eurythmics, very much this kind of style. So I've done a lot of name checking of other people. I hope they're people that you have some awareness of. Otherwise, all that's going to fall flat for you. I would say, for me, musically, it's nice. Production, obviously, is exquisite. The bass and percussion are really nice. There's some great grooves, and some great kind of spacey sounds in here. The songs are kind of apparently based around a concept of a fantasy country called Shadowland. But there are songs about various things in here. Ones that I can pick out: American Roulette, which is about mega fame and focuses on three characters from American mega fame, and Fallen Angel is about a dead bandmate of Robbie's. And Somewhere Down That Crazy River, which is a great track, is a kind of film noir narrative. His singing is pretty good, I would say. He's got a fairly expressive voice. He's got a fairly kind of rockish voice. He could support doing heavier stuff than this if he wanted to, but I think it works reasonably well. It also kind of contrasts well with the Peter Gabriel vocals when he's in there, and with the Bono vocals when he's in as well. So I think this is a strong album. It was a pleasant surprise for me. It surprised and delighted me quite a bit. I'd love to know, as always, what you think of this album, so please do tell me about it. Leave me a comment. And that's it from me for now.
Yeah, I can see it now. The distant red neon shivered in the heat. I was feeling like a stranger in a strange land. You know, where people play games with the night. God, it was too hot to sleep.